Where to begin? Okay, well, I do not trust the government at all. Shocker, I'm Candace Owens. But how did I arrive at that conclusion that the government was lying to us about virtually everything? Well, it usually starts with just one thing. For me, it was vaccines. It was becoming vaccine injured and then becoming vaccine obsessed to understand how I had allowed a foreign substance into my body and knew nothing about that foreign substance and yet trusted the experts. And then, yeah, I came out of the other side realizing that virtually every vaccine, the story that we are told, this is really just a program of social engineering. They scare us into compliance, they lie about various things, and they omit a ton of information. And so then after that, I would say all things became plausible. Now I listen to people who I once upon a time would have found to be very strange. Oh, that person's a conspiracy theorist, I would have said. And now I know who came up with that term, conspiracy theorist, the government. The CIA did. After JFK was shot by just one person, just a random act of violence against a president. And then they paid, via Operation Mockingbird, a bunch of journalists to lie about the narrative, to control the narrative. Yeah, so I'll have a lot of things I ask questions about, and I tend to try to find people who get equally as obsessed with a topic and present interesting theories. Now, I'm sure you remember this event. Let's go back to 2014. There was an airline carrier, a Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, MH370, which went missing. And then it was in the news, and then magically it was not in the news, and we never really got an answer to what happened to MH370. Well, the person I'm inviting on the show today has quite the theory. Some people might think that that theory is completely kooky. I don't, not at all. And I'm going to allow him to explain it to you. Ashton Forbes, welcome to Candace.
Thank you, Candace Owens. I'm happy to be here. I'm super excited for this interview.
All right, so I was just on X,
Yeah.
scrolling through posts, looking for different topics, and I came across a very long post that you did, and it was about MH370. And then in the back of my mind, I went, oh my gosh, yeah, what actually did happen to MH370? So if you could just remind people, because they're probably also equally as dusty on this narrative, what happened on that day? It's March 8th, 2014. How many passengers get on this plane that was supposed to be traveling from the Kuala Lumpur airport to Beijing in China?
Yeah, there was 239 people. And I just want to first say that those people have families, and I have the utmost respect for those families. In fact, I first started this investigation because those families deserve the truth.
Hmm.
And I think that anybody that would say, oh, you're hurting the families by looking into this, they should listen and look at how the families responded after that plane disappeared. Those families went on major news stations and they knew something was wrong with this plane and with the story. They knew they weren't being told all the information that was out there. So this plane took off around 1642 UTC from Kuala Lumpur, and it goes dark over the South China Sea about 40 minutes later. The last communication that we were given publicly was just a mundane communication, good night, Malaysian Airlines 370. Now, this is where the mystery really began because for several days, that was all we knew. This plane went dark somewhere over the South China Sea. Nobody really has any idea. And you can start to see, going back to your comment about conspiracies, that right away something wasn't right. It seemed like there might be a cover up at play because several days later they said, oh no, this plane actually didn't crash anywhere near the South China Sea or anything. It turned back over Malaysia, flew over the peninsula of Malaysia, and it flew directly to Penang Airport. And then it deviates again, and they end up losing it on military radar. And then it takes a few days, and around March 13th, 5 days after this plane disappears, unnamed US intelligence sources float to the media that this plane potentially went into the South Indian Ocean, which is really convenient. That's like saying, oh, it just fell down a well somewhere and we're never going to probably be able to find it, went to the worst possible location. Now, it wasn't until about 2.5 months later that finally they released these Inmarsat pings that say this is what the U.S. intelligence, indicates that the plane went to the South Indian Ocean.
Now, just to slow this down for people that don't even know what an Inmarsat ping
Yeah.
is, just describe to them what the satellite pings actually are.
So the logic was they have these satellites in geostationary orbit, and they are pinging the airliners all the time. And what was interesting is that this airplane was actually between two different satellites. Should have been pinging both of them, but interestingly enough, it stopped pinging one of them before it took off and never pinged that satellite ever again. Why this is problematic is that we couldn't triangulate the position anymore. If you have multiple pings, you can triangulate the exact position of the plane. So these pings get released, but the company itself and no government officials do any analysis on them. They leave it to bloggers on the internet to say, go figure out what you think happened. This is where something called the independent group gets formed. A bunch of
Now, just
people.
to be clear, who controls those Inmarsat satellites?
Yeah.
Who owns them, so to
Yeah,
speak?
so the company Inmarsat actually has connections to US intelligence as well. Of course they do, right? And if you look at some of the people that are like on their board, it's a bunch of admirals and generals and things like that from the United States government. So what the data basically, I've looked at the data myself. It's one of those things where, basically no one ever looks at it. They just take everything they hear at face value without looking at the data. My job is in healthcare is working with databases all the time. So a relational database is just a bunch of Excel spreadsheets that are kind of linked together. So when I looked at this data, this Excel spreadsheet of these pings, I started scrolling through it from the plane taking off, and you get to the part where this plane was like, they lost contact, radar contact with it around 1840, and the data just kind of stops. And the next 10 rows of data are like 5 hours of the plane flying into the South Indian Ocean. And I look at that, I go, how could anybody look at this and say that this looks normal? You've got hundreds of rows of data, and then you've got tens of rows of data. And what this would indicate is this location in the Nicobar Islands, they used these satellite pings to say, okay, this plane goes past Penang, it turns, deviates, starts flying through the Straits of Malacca and the Andaman Sea. And then it gets to this point in the Nicobar Islands and makes a sharp turn south into the South Indian Ocean. That supposedly it runs out of fuel and crashes down there, is what they claim, despite us never having found a debris field at all. And what these independent group experts, so to speak, say is that they look at these BTO offsets. So they're basically saying, what's the time between the satellite connecting to the airplane? How far is it away from the airplane? What was the interval of the message that was received? And they use this to create an arc. And they say, okay, well, the plane must have been along this arc at some point. And this is how we found what they call the seventh arc in the South Indian Ocean, the last satellite ping. What they don't tell you is that there were some rows on here that they couldn't make sense of, so they just kind of cut them out. And what we're going to find from the videos that had reemerged on social media about a year ago that inspired me to investigate this is that there's coordinates in the video that's called Satellite Video, Airliner and UFOs. And those coordinates are the Nicobar Islands. They're the location where this plane supposedly turned into the South Indian Ocean. So as an investigator, you look at this case and you say, you've got your first point in the South China Sea where this plane goes dark. So something happened there. And you've got your second point at the Penang airport, the closest airport to go to an emergency situation. The plane deviates and changes direction and doesn't land there. And your third point is that point in the Nicobar Islands where all of a sudden the plane's taking a sharp south turn into the South Indian Ocean. And you look at those 3 points and I go, okay, well, what are the scenarios that make sense for what happened to this plane? The prevailing narrative right now is that this pilot went on some kind of suicide route or something like this, which to me makes no sense at all. So they would say that, okay, well, the first point, the pilot turned off somehow all the electronics in the plane, made it untraceable.
Right, like all the transponders.
The
Yeah.
transponder, and it's not even clear that that's actually possible. One of the first questions a New York Times reporter asked in one of the press conferences was, is it even possible to make a plane go dark like this? And the Minister of Transportation's response is, we'll have to look into that. You're like, there's a plane missing here, and you're being evasive about answering basic questions that should just be obvious. The first question, that's what the New York Times reporter says. And the second point is Penang Airport. So this is where this narrative out there says, and you're not going to believe this because you shouldn't, is that he was saying goodbye to his hometown because apparently he grew up in Penang or something like that. And you're like, well, it's 2 a.m. You're flying a suicide route or something, and you're flying over a town to say goodbye to it. Makes no sense at all. And then the third point, that point in the Nicobar Islands, they don't have any answer for. In fact, we know that there was actually 5 radars from at least 3 different countries, Thailand, India, and Indonesia that were all still in range after Malaysia supposedly lost contact with this plane off of radar. None of those countries have ever come forward about this. And Aaron Rodgers actually was asked about me. He's a football player for people who don't know. And one of the things that he said, which was true, is that there's some, like the engine companies should have data on this, Rolls-Royce and Boeing. And they should. In fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal several days after the plane disappeared that was retracted later on. And Rolls-Royce has never made their data available. Rolls-Royce data, I've heard various metrics on this, but some say that that data could be pinging back to Rolls-Royce from the engine like every 15 seconds, which would indicate there's no chance they don't know what happened to the plane. So you've got all this information that's just never made publicly available. And it should beg the question for people like, what is going on here? The biggest thing, though, is what is the US government hiding? The United States government has something called SBIRS, Space-Based Infrared System. Some people may have heard about it. Some podcasters have actually brought this system up. It's built by Lockheed Martin. We use constellations of satellites now. It's not like Enemy of the State in the 90s with Will Smith and Gene Hackman where you're just looking down through a satellite anymore. We actually only have 5 optical satellites left in outer space. All the rest are radar and infrared. And we have this constellation of satellites constantly scanning the entire globe. And they're beaming that information to ground-based computers. It's not just real time. You can, just like when we flew past Pluto with our, the satellite we sent out there and we built this image of Pluto, you can do the same thing with planet Earth, but in real time. So presumably we have like real-time coverage of the entire planet. And you're telling me that a Boeing 777, this plane is the size of a city block, holds 300 people, crashed somewhere in the ocean, then didn't leave a debris field that we couldn't see on a satellite, or China or Russia or any of the other countries that have satellites, nobody saw it anywhere? But there's more than that. We also have something called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, which is a Navy system that's been around since like the 40s or 50s. This is the one that heard that Titan sub pop that was near the Titanic.
Yeah.
That was a big giveaway because what happened? All the news stations had these oxygen counters going down. They've got 48 hours of oxygen left or whatever. The Navy knew that sub imploded for 5 days and they never said anything. And then after it turned out that we found out that it imploded, they came out and admitted, yes, it imploded. And the thing that was really kind of revealing to me is how quickly the Navy went down and found the parts. Like they had triangulated the exact location of that sub. And that's a tiny little submersible. So if they could detect that, how could they not detect a Boeing 777 crashing into the ocean? There was even this Cardiff University scientific paper that was just released in May of this year. And they looked at these acoustic detectors. This is not the SOSUS system, but just acoustic detectors. One in Diego Garcia military base in the Maldives, and another one off the coast of Western Australia. These are not quite, the crash site, supposedly 7th Arc, is somewhere in between these two locations. They didn't find any acoustic detections for the whole duration of the flight path that were consistent with a plane hitting the ocean, even on a slow descent. They found one from one acoustic detector that was about half an hour to an hour after the plane would have already ran out of fuel. So doesn't really make any sense there. And they also showed the math. They looked at a bunch of other similar situations and they said, there's no chance that we wouldn't have heard it if it had actually crashed down there. And then the last piece of information regarding our surveillance capabilities is over-the-horizon radar. So a lot of people think of radar as like this line of sight type ranging and detection system. But actually, we have something called over-the-horizon radar, which bounces off the ionosphere and can see and to detect aircrafts, missiles, et cetera, for thousands of miles. So we have 2 of the most advanced military bases in the world, Diego Garcia Military Base and Pine Gap in Australia there, both of which theoretically would be within range of the entire flight path of this plane. And you're telling me that none of these systems saw anything? The last bit is there was 2 military exercises going on in that area next to Thailand. It's called Cobra Gold and Cope Tiger. The Cobra Gold exercises had just ended and the Cope Tiger exercises were just about to begin. It was between Thailand, United States, and Singapore. I believe China was actually a guest during that exercise that year as well. The Cope Tiger exercises, the theme was search and rescue that year as well. So presumably they would have had all the assets right there in that area, most advanced assets. You're telling me a Boeing 777 flew past our military exercises and we just didn't see it at all? This doesn't make any sense. So we know the United States government, beyond any shadow of a doubt, must know what happened to this plane.
Do you want to have a deeper prayer life but don't know where to start? Well, I get that, and so does Hallow, which is why I'm excited to tell you about Hallow's new prayer challenge, How to Pray. Prayer can be such a daunting thing to undertake. Where do you start? What do you say? I remember when I was first learning about Catholicism being in awe at how many different practices there are when it comes to prayer. But it does not need to be overwhelming. Hallow's new prayer challenge will take you through short daily sessions over the next 2 weeks with an all-star lineup of spiritual leaders and guests, giving you all of the essentials to creating a rich prayer life. They'll teach you how to pray through scripture, how to do imaginative prayer, how to incorporate prayers that have been around for centuries, and so much more. You'll get a new guide every day, and some of the guides include Father Mike Schmitz, Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus in The Chosen, and Mark Wahlberg, plus many others. The only way that we can get through these crazy times is by setting first things first, which is why getting closer to God and prayer is the best way to do that. So download the Hallow app for 3 months free at hallow.com/Candace. That's hallow.com/Candace.
So when this happened back in 2014, I was not as awake as I am now. I was not awake at all, actually. I was fully asleep. And it's interesting because what you're describing, I now realize that they have been engaging in this for a very long time. It is the government that engages in disinformation. So what they try to do is when something happens and people are confused about it, they put out so many possible theories. I mean, you're talking like a game of Clue, or I guess people in the UK would call it a game of Cluedo. And it's essentially the butler did it in the pantry. It just and then you're like, oh, well, I read here in the New York Times that they think that it could have like the pilot was a drunk and got into a fight and wanted to just fly over and say goodbye. Well, I read here over here in the Wall Street Journal that what actually happened was it ran out of fuel. I read here that it was on fire. So there's actually so much information that is intentionally put out there to confuse people that they can't actually get to truth, but they're sure that they're getting closer to truth by consuming all of this because it's coming from the experts, it's coming from sources. And once you understand that that is their repeat pattern, which is basically to flood the zone with so much information, but there's actually no information. And I do agree. The most ridiculous one for me was this pilot on like a murder-suicide mission. First off, just talking about mental stability, like pilots tend to be like the most mentally stable people.
Yeah.
And there was absolutely nothing to back up their claims. It sounded like such an exercise to just disinform the public and say, oh, I think years later they said, well, they never told us, but when they went to go look through his house, they saw that he had mapped out geographically the exact route they took. Why would he have to do that? He's a pilot. He doesn't have to map out. He knows to do that like while he's in the plane. And so when I look back on it now, I'm like, wow, it just follows that standard pattern of a classic military intelligence operation cover-up. And I want to allow people right now to watch these 2 videos that I'm going to show them. These videos, actually, first we're going to watch the video that's not thermal, which was, how many years later did it come into the public sphere?
Yeah, so the satellite video was the first video to get published. The satellite video was published May 19th, 2014. So this is 70 days after the plane disappears. But in the description of the video, and this was from a Regicide Anon YouTube account, that was the name of the YouTuber, Regicide Anon, some obscure YouTube account with a dozen followers or something like that. This video actually in the description says, received March 12th, 2014. That's 4 days after the plane disappeared. It says source, protected. And this was a YouTube account that was somehow associated with the UFO phenomenon. We've seen their other videos they have on there. Anything remotely similar to this. So we don't know exactly what their source was. When we dug through it, it seems like there might have been like a forum that's like Spanish-based, that maybe somehow these videos got on there and people started posting them. Because this was just the first person to post them. Other people ended up posting them later on. So this right away starts to build this time frame for, okay, you've got a very small window of opportunity to make this video. And when people look at this satellite video, a lot of people, first of all, can't even tell what direction you're looking. People go, well, where's outer space? And you're going, no, you're looking down. You're not looking up. So it goes to show this is why the United States government protects surveillance capabilities so well, because if we find out about our surveillance capabilities, then we can feed through some of that disinformation and we can figure out, oh, wait, no, we absolutely must know about a plane disappearing, and you can apply it to other world events that go on as well. And so it makes it much harder for them to misinform the public that's out there. But again, the strongest evidence on the satellite video is the coordinates. It's got these coordinates in the bottom left. And Newsweek actually published a fake debunk 2 days after these videos got popular on August 9th, 2023. These videos got popular on August 7th of last year in 2023. 2 days later, Newsweek all of a sudden posts this debunk. And it's just a copy and paste, like an AI took it from another article that was out there. The only factual claim in there was that in those coordinates it said NROL 33, which is a National Reconnaissance Office launch of satellites. The problem was that the NROL 33 was launched in like 2015 or late 2014, so after the videos were out there. So they said, oh, it must be fake. But if you just look at the coordinates, you can realize it doesn't say NROL 33. It says NROL 22. NROL 22 is USA 184. This satellite was launched in 2006, and it was the first satellite launch of the SBIR system, space-based infrared system that was out there. To me, that's quite the coincidence for someone to put that down there. It turns out on these constellations of satellites, they use relay satellites because not all satellites are within range of the ground-based systems that they need. And NRL 22, USA 184, has a millennial orbit. So it takes this oblong orbit, which seems like it's, I think they call mid-Earth orbit satellites. It's a good candidate to be a relay satellite because it spends a lot of its time above the North Pole, which is it's in angle of view of many other satellites that are out there. And the coordinates, initially we weren't sure, like you, I only woke up, in the last, let's say, 4 to 8 years. I was someone who I call CNN brain type person who just believed whatever the TV told you. And so I thought, well, this plane must have crashed in the South Indian Ocean because that's what all the narratives were down there. So when you looked at the coordinates, if you had added a minus sign in front of the north-south coordinate, it actually put the plane in the South Indian Ocean somewhere. And I thought, okay, even though it was like hard to explain why there might be a minus sign, like just cut off that you couldn't see, I thought this must be what it is. But when we actually graphed the coordinate shifts, because you have this perspective shift on this satellite video, we realized there's no possible way for it to have a minus sign there, because if you graphed it, either it must be going south into the east or north into the east. And if you're going north into the east, you're turning to the right. If you're going south into the east, you're turning to the left. Well, we have two videos that both show a plane turning to its left. That means this must be, there's no minus sign, that must be the Nicobar Islands. It's within 100 miles of where a real life witness saw the plane that she's just been discredited as well. At the same time, that the day the plane was lost, they said that the plane was lost at Subang Air Traffic Control, lost contact with the plane at 1840 UTC. That's the same time the witness saw the plane. That's the same time the plane would have been in this area where this video is filming it. So you look at it, you go, okay, for me, I've already got enough evidence that like, I need the US government to say something about these videos, but there's more.
Well, let's show
Okay.
let's show that first video right now. So this is one of these exercises that I say to people, but the mainstream media and the intelligence agencies are now instructing us not to believe your own eyes. So I know you just saw and you're going, wait a minute, what just happened? I was following this and then suddenly it's gone. And so your brain is coming online and you're going, wasn't I trained by the mainstream media not to believe my own eyes? Somebody will explain to me, oh, this is a fake video. Something's wrong with it. And I do also want to show you guys this alongside the thermal image of this happening as well. Where did we get this, the thermal image? Was this created after the fact?
Same account. So same exact account, about 2 weeks. So it actually on the thermal video, it's the first video is just called Satellite Video, Airliner, and UFOs. It doesn't say anything about MH370, but we dug through the metadata, and there's a tag in the metadata for MH370. The second video says it's like UAV drone video, and then in the description says alternate angle from previous video. It says received June 5th, 2014, published June 12th, 2014. So this was, 2 to 3 weeks after that first video. And now you start to build like a story in terms of, okay, this first video comes out, and if this is a real video, someone's leaked this, they want people to pick it up. Nobody picks it up. And then all of a sudden, boom, now we've got a second video from a Predator drone from a completely different angle than the first one. And so when people ask, like, what would it take for you to be convinced that something's real? It's like, well, I want 2 different videos from, different angles, from high quality sources, military sources. And you know what? Put one of them in infrared and the other one in a thermal.
And make sure they line up, the time lines up.
Yeah, line up
they
perfectly.
do.
And they in sync. We've dug through it, can't find any discrepancy, not even in the movement of the orbs or on the plane, nothing at all out there. And going back real quick to the satellite video, probably the other most compelling piece is you see this cursor, mouse cursor, come off the top right of the screen. Because if this is a real video, that's a recording of someone's computer. And they're on a much bigger field of view. So you can tell because this mouse comes off the top of the side of the screen and they probably just hit start record. And the mouse comes on the screen and you can actually tell the mouse stays still when the perspective shifts. And people looked at the mouse and the background of that satellite video is 6 frames per second. It's kind of like slowly jerky a little bit. You can kind of tell with your eyes. But the cursor is actually 24 frames per second. And people pieced it together right away that this is consistent with a Citrix session, a remote terminal session. So for people that aren't familiar with working at big companies and potentially the government, a lot of the data is being stored in databases that are remotely hosted. So what you do, you log in to that database, to that server, and you access the data on that computer server. And when you do that, almost everybody I know uses Citrix. So now, if these videos are fake, someone is like, knows how our systems are set up out there.
And they did it very quickly.
And very, very quickly. Or somebody saw these videos, just like the people watching this right now, and kind of freaked out and went, wait, what? And they were like, the world has to know because no one's going to figure this out without seeing these videos.
But they're not trying to end up like Edward Snowden having to learn Russian
Yes.
and because they've revealed some sort of a government secret. So they just put it onto the internet and let the internet do what the internet does.
And I think that to your point about the CIA disinformation stuff as well, they probably didn't even realize how much control the government has over the media. Like to Project Mockingbird, for example, I absolutely believe that the government controls the perception of the media strongly. And they probably just thought they would end up being like a hero or something, or that the media would pick up on this. But of course, the government was never going to let that happen. So these videos got no traction anywhere. And most people, even myself in 2014, I remember seeing the drone video. You can tell it's a drone because you can see the drone's nose in the video. And these drones actually have these slots that are customizable on the wings, where you can pull out, you can put a Hellfire missile on there, whatever. You can put a camera on there. We've found the drones that have cameras in that exact location as well. Like an MQ-1C Gray Eagle is one of those. So they might have thought that the media was going to pick up on this, and then they never did.
Of course, the media's job is to not pick up on that specifically.
And the world had no idea. Like I looked at that drone video and I just didn't know what I was looking at in 2014 because I followed this case back then as just, an independent citizen and civilian and thought, well, that's a weird video. And this was before the DoD Navy released those UFO videos and declassified them. And even that, so before that, I didn't even know we used like forward-looking infrared, FLIR. So I had no idea of even the basis of our technology capabilities from a surveillance perspective. But now in 2023, when I saw those videos again, I went, whoa, I remember seeing this. And for me, it was when I saw that second video and I went, okay, This is bizarre. And then when I saw the citric session evidence, I went, okay, this is like way too much. And I asked the question, instead of everybody else saying, this must be fake, this is stupid, blah, 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 I said, what would it take for this video to be real? And that's when I started investigating the stories that we've been told, the evidence that's out there, the witnesses. And just as a summary, like I've accumulated so much evidence around the real situation around this plane that the only way anyone could convince me these videos are not real is either this hoaxer, supposedly, that made them would have to come forward.
Which you have offered money.
Yeah, we had a $150,000 bounty. So, and this was real money. Like we had Kim.com threw up 100,000. Chad and Sherry, the Investigate Earth podcast, who I've become very good friends with over just talking about this stuff on many of their podcasts, they threw up another 20,000. And then I had a wealthy supporter that had run for higher office, that actually run for Congress in the past, that texted me and was like, I'll throw another 25,000 in. And I was like, well, I'll throw 5,000 just to round it out. So for months, we had this out there. And there's a lot of disinformation about that where people say, oh, well, it's to prove the videos are fake. But it was, I mean, I need proof. And the only way to get proof is you need the hoaxer to come forward with, here's the work that I did. Because
it's not a crime. I mean, you can just be like, yeah, I hoaxed you. I did a good job, but I'm taking
exactly.
150K.
And, you know, maybe Disney will pick you up or some
Yeah,
major
like, it was
VFX
pretty
team.
good,
Look at
yeah.
that. Look at that work, you know? You think about like the psychological profile of the hoaxer doesn't really make much sense either, but nobody ended up coming forward. In fact, it started to draw like people trying to just like lie about it as well. So after several months, I realized no one's gonna ever come forward. We ended up taking the bounty down because people were trying to scam me and do all this other stuff because people are just horrible, honestly. But yeah, you would take the hoaxer to come forward with their source work, because if you made these, you're not deleting that off your hard drive. You're going to save that forever. Or finding the plane. But even finding the plane at this point, like that plane better be like fully intact with like 239 bodies on it at the bottom of the ocean somewhere with 10 years of decay on it, right? Because where is this plane? Like, how does the plane even hit the ocean without breaking into a million pieces?
Before we get to your theory,
Yeah.
which is the only thing that makes sense if I believe my own eyes, the debris did turn up years later. Speak about that. Speak about
Yeah,
that,
absolutely.
or a very
No,
small
absolutely.
piece of the
Let
plane.
me
so to
address
speak.
the arguments and the claims that people make that I think people are well known about. Is that, first of all, this pilot suicide, I call it the pilot suicide myth, because there is really no physical evidence for the pilot suicide scenario. If you were to crash a plane like the Germanwings guy did in 2015, he locked the co-pilot out and he crashed the plane in under 10 minutes. I went and looked it up because people were trying to compare the two scenarios. He didn't go on an 8-hour joyride. He certainly didn't fly to the nearest airport to land a Boeing 777. The narrative about, there was all this misinformation spread about the pilot saying that like he was into girl, like some cheating on his wife, or he had mental issues. They tried to claim he was a terrorist. Like all this stuff was fake. Florence Achangi is probably the #1 investigator that I respect related to MH370. I've spoken to her several times. She actually got his medical records. His family released them to her, and there was no red flags mentally. He had nothing wrong whatsoever with him. And then they start passing this simulator data that you were mentioning out around, and they said, oh, well, this proves that he planned this route. But if you actually dug into the facts, it turned out from that simulator data was from February 2nd and February 3rd. And it was actually MH370 from Kuala Lumpur to Jeddah. And he was scheduled to fly that route February 4th. So he was literally just practicing. And I've got a graph or an image out there that shows like all the MH370 routes. And it's exactly the same as what they're saying was on this simulator data. And then they take one single point in the South Indian Ocean, they just connect it together and claim, oh, that's the route, even though it doesn't match at all the real route of the MH370.
But you know what it does do? It bars everybody else out, because the majority of people who don't understand that are not going to dig that deeply. So they just
Exactly.
need something that, okay, how do we button up this little mystery and feed that to the public and say, oh, look, we figured it out. Actually, we dug through his stuff and he was plotting out this route and he actually was a crazy person, even though his wife says he was and everyone around him says he wasn't. But we just need our fall guy, and we're picking the pilot, and somehow he was able to do some James Bond type and hitting the transponders, went on a little joyride, waved goodbye to his hometown. I mean, it sounds insane. Like the conspiracy is what they always sell you. Like that is more insane than the concept of they're hiding something and your government is lying to you.
Exactly. And even if you don't want to believe the videos are real just because you can't believe that we have that kind of technology, you have to believe that the government knows what really happened to this plane. There's just too much evidence for that. And you have to be able to tell that there's some kind of obfuscation going on with regards to this whole situation. It stinks start to finish. So yeah, and yeah, like you said, his family, his coworkers, everybody ruled it out. The FBI even looked at the simulator data. They ruled it out. The officials ruled out the simulator data, but somehow this narrative keeps spreading. And so what people will say is, well, the ocean is really big, so it could have crashed basically anywhere. But that's not true, because remember, we have these satellite pings. These satellite pings indicate the seventh arc is where this plane ran out of fuel. So unless you think planes can fly without fuel, which maybe some people do out there, then that's as far as it can possibly go. And they searched up and down the entire flight path to the seventh arc as well, including the largest, most expensive search in human history. They've done 2 above and below water searches there, and they're planning a 3rd in November. They never found a single thing. And then people say, well, didn't they find some debris? Well, again, this is one of those things where if you look into it, all of a sudden it just makes no sense. Like the Netflix documentary, which I personally think was one of the worst documentaries I've ever seen in my entire life, just didn't even cover a fraction of the evidence that's out there. They mentioned that this flaperon washes up in the Reunion Island. And I will give Jeff Wise a little bit of credit because he can't really see the full picture, but he can tell that there's something wrong with certain pieces of evidence. And this flaperon in the Reunion Island, this is near Africa. If you look at the actual supposed crash site and you look at the debris drift analysis, which was performed before they found any of the debris, all the debris should have washed up in Western Australia. The currents down there flow to the east.
You can't change the direction of the currents.
As far as I know, we're not changing the ocean currents. And then you go and it says even for that piece to get to the Reunion Island, it would take roughly 2 years. Well, they found it in just over 1 year. So right now, just basic physics, basic math says, how did this get there? So what they do is they throw some boards in the ocean and they realize right away, no chance it's going to make it to the Reunion Island. In fact, I think they had it shown up in the Middle East somewhere based on their models. So they go, ignore that. That didn't happen. And they get a flaperon and they think they tie down part of it so that it sticks out of the water a little bit. And they go,
I'm sorry to ask a dumb question. What is a flapper?
A flaperon is a piece of the airplane. It's around 7 to 8 feet long.
Okay.
And it's one of the things that kind of moves up and down on the wing of the aircraft.
Yes, that thing that literally flaps.
And for people to say, oh, this is a giant piece of the plane, it's really not. Each one of those wings is 100 feet long. So this is a 7 to 8 foot piece of that. In fact, I looked it up recently. You don't even need a flapper on the fly, and you don't need a flapper on the land either. So this doesn't even prove that a plane crashed.
But they're saying that they did find this flaperon debris here off the coast of Africa. You're saying, okay, wait a second, the tides absolutely cannot. And even if the tides could, it would have taken 2 years for it to arrive here.
Yeah.
So the math is not mathing, as we say.
Exactly. And what I want to tell people who are watching too is that I believe the debris they found is actually from MH370. In fact, I think that the story that I put forth is one of the only stories that makes sense for that debris to be from MH370 because I've got the plane going somewhere completely different than this South Indian Ocean narrative that's going on. But they also, when they saw this flaperon sticking out of the water like this, they went, oh, that's enough, because now we can argue that the wind was going to blow on it. And so this is somehow how it defied the ocean currents to get to Reunion Island. The problem was there was barnacles on the piece that was sticking out of the water. Well, how is that possible? How are barnacles forming out of the water on there? And then they looked at the growth of the barnacles, and they found that the barnacle growth is only 4 months. Well, okay, but now it takes 2 years to get there, but you've only got 4 months of barnacle growth on it. And so they have to come up with all these convoluted reasons. Now, the flaperon, there was about, I don't know, let's say 10 to 20 pieces. That was by far the biggest piece. The rest are just tiny pieces like this. There was a Rolls-Royce engine cowling, which is the piece on the engine or whatever. It's got the big RR on it. Shows up in South Africa. That's almost 3,000 miles away from the crash site in about 18 months, somewhere like that, after the plane disappeared. Literally impossible for it to float that far. So the flaperon is actually the closest location. All the rest of this stuff was on mainland Africa. And you look at that, you go, there's just absolutely no possible chance it could have crashed in that site. So the reason why then I ask people, show me on the map where you think this plane crashed, is because if you don't think that the satellite pings are correct, that this seventh arc is not where the plane ended, then you have to throw out the satellite pings. Either they've been fabricated or misinterpreted or something. And remember, I looked at those, and I think anybody else should look at them themselves and realize it doesn't look right. You know, the way the data just, it's too sparse. And I even talked to some of these independent group experts, and I asked, why does the data just like cut off right here at 1840 when this plane is in the Nicobar Islands? Nobody could give me a straight answer. They would just say, it's normal, it's normal. I'm going, nothing about this situation is normal. Like, this is extraordinary. So this is where, like, if the satellite pings are not correct, then if you look at the totality of the evidence, it presents a completely different story of what happened to this plane. And my approach has been, when I looked at this, I want to take all the evidence, everything that was thrown out, dismissed, rejected, and I wanted to look at it all totality. And I found that the only thing you have to throw out is the satellite pings after the Nicobar Islands. And you've got a comprehensive story that's got 20 witnesses, completely different event that people had actually speculated on, that like PhD experts had speculated on, et cetera, that is also potentially consistent with the videos and consistent with where that debris showed up.
Okay. So for my people who are not science-minded, I want you to know that the reason that you're not science-minded is because the government doesn't want you to be. That's the overwhelming majority of people in society who don't excel, especially in Western society, in math or science. I believe there's a reason for that, because it gives the people that do excel in it a tremendous amount of power over you. But you do still have two eyes. You did just watch that video. You think you saw something that was flying, and then maybe what you might describe as UFOs, 3 of them surrounding it, and then suddenly everything seems to have disappeared. I'm now going to introduce for you guys a video of somebody describing a technology which somebody theorized could have been produced. This guy theorized about it in 1990. And I guess we'll just call it Star Trek technology. Take a look at this video.
The concept of warp drive was first imagined by science fiction author John Campbell way back in 1931 in his novel Islands of Space. However, it wasn't until 1990s that physicist Miguel Alcubierre proposed a real-world method of achieving faster-than-light travel. This concept was based on the works of Kip Thorne and his research on wormholes and time travel. However, while wormholes remain completely theoretical, the Alcubierre warp drive is based on established laws of physics. So, how does it work? The key to warp drive is in fact in its name. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, space-time can be warped by gravity, and that is the reason why planets and stars are attracted to each other. The Alcubierre warp drive takes this idea a step further by suggesting that instead of propelling the spaceship at the speed of light, we can warp the space around the spaceship, thus connecting 2 distant points in space and covering the distance at normal speed. The Alcubierre warp drive would work by creating a bubble of space-time around the spacecraft. This bubble would contract the space in front of the spacecraft and expand the space behind it, thus allowing the spacecraft to ride a wave of space-time. It's like surfing, but on a cosmic scale, allowing it to travel at a speed faster than light without actually breaking the cosmic limit. See, the spaceship isn't moving at the speed of light, but the space around it is.
So that's an odd thing, but don't worry, like that guy says, like, it doesn't exist yet. It's a theory that you could, I guess, ride a wave and something would just move an object faster than the speed of light. It's not like our government has any technology like that. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Keep learning about the social sciences at school. So that seems far out, and yet it kind of is the only thing that could make sense. Now, before we get into that, let's just talk about what people actually say they saw that day, because then if you go, okay, if this thing did actually happen, why would it happen? Why wouldn't you just land the plane and not have to send out the intelligence agencies and the Operation Mockingbird people to cover this event? Like, if the government is involved, why?
Yeah, great question. And I think you made a great point as well, is that we've stopped believing what we see with our eyes, and that is one of the things that's really blown me away, is how easy it is for the government to lie to us and throw us off the scent for stuff, even when we have this massive amount of evidence. I remember when I was on with the confessionals with Tony Merkel. It was the first in-person interview I did, and I was still fresh in the case last year around September. And I was trying to figure out, what's the overall story? Why did we cover this up? Is this a situation where there's some kind of espionage angle at play, or is this some kind of UFO situation that's going on here? We've got these orbs circling around the plane. I knew enough about Star Trek and Huckleberry Drive to think like, like, is that what's going on? So I started digging into the case of it. So we've heard now the suicide narrative that's out there, and that's generally the prevalent one. The narrative that doesn't get talked about a lot is the fire narrative. And I think the fire narrative has so much evidence it's almost undeniable. There was already a bunch of situations before Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 where planes had burnt up and from lithium-ion batteries in their cargo bay. And it turns out that Malaysian Airlines CEO just didn't tell people that there was 500 pounds of dangerous lithium-ion batteries in the cargo of this plane until March 20th, 2014. So this is 2 weeks after the plane disappeared. Now, why would they lie about that for so long? It turns out it missed 2 security screenings as well. Now, I spoke to Billy Vincent. So I started Googling around saying MH370 fire. And I started finding these experts that were talking about these news articles about it. One was Dr. Edel. He's in a Daily Beast article you can read. He says, what happened is perfectly consistent with a fire event. And Billy Vincent had speculated even before March 20th that this was a fire event. So I actually reached out to him recently and said, sir, could I talk to you about how you knew that this plane had a fire event going on related to it? And he told me that he had looked into, or he was former security director for the FAA back in like the 80s, maybe 90s. And he said, well, I looked at like UPS Flight 6, and this was a flight that I think was either UAE or Dubai, somewhere over there. And it was a cargo plane, UPS, and it was carrying lithium-ion batteries. And in that scenario, the batteries ignited in the cargo, smoke accumulated in the plane. It actually occluded the windows for the cockpit. And the pilot tried to put their gas mask on. They got out of their seat to grab their mask that was right behind them, passed out immediately because that's how dangerous the smoke is. Like just 1 to 2 inhalations and you're out.
Wow. See, I've always wondered why they always ask you now, do you have any lithium batteries that you're
Yes.
carrying in your luggage? So this is the reason why, because lithium ion has this, it means obviously highly flammable. What's actually creating that? Because I don't understand it. What creates that environment that it makes it so dangerous for it to be flown?
And yeah, this is where like when I started finding out the lithium batteries, because I asked the same thing. The first thing I said is like, oh, this is why they're asking me when I go mail a letter at the post office, like a letter. They're like, is there a lithium ion battery in here? I'm going, it's a letter. What are you talking about? Because they're so afraid that a plane was going to burn up. Now, what Mr. Vincent told me was that, especially back in the early 2010s, and the manufacturers probably won't admit to this, but they used to have common defects were very common in these batteries. Now, lithium-ion batteries are extremely dense with energy, which is why we use them in phones, computers, Tesla cars, scooters, everything that's out there. And they're prone to something called thermal runaway, which means that once they ignite, and it's usually the 2 common causes are either they overheat or they have a defect in them. Like if you dent it, that will cause it to just boom and essentially start to ignite. And the problem is you can't get them out. Even if you put it out temporarily, it just comes back up again.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, and so
And that's what's in our phones.
yeah, this was in our phone. Now, I think they've probably improved them since then, but what I'll say is that the FAA, like if you look at the timeline on the FAA's website, they have a graph with these lithium-ion battery incidents on them as well. And we really didn't know much about them in the early 2010s. Actually, even now, 2023, 2022, the last 2 years they've accumulated data, there's over 70 incidents of lithium-ion batteries starting on fire in the passenger area of passenger planes every year. So that's like over 1 a week that these are happening. And this is a situation where just like people's phones are lighting up, and then they throw them in this bag and they like pour water on them because there's no easy way to put them out. The Halon 1301 fire suppression devices they have in these airplanes can't keep them out. They just keep coming back up and up and up again. So you look at the scenario, this is exactly what happened with UPS Flight 6.
500 pounds.
Yeah, so this is, and 2 of these were, we looked through everything. We looked at the cargo, and we found out they were stacked up in the forward cargo bay, 2 pallets of them, right next to the equipment, the equipment bay, the electronics bay, which is where all your sensitive electronics are. And this was another reason why Mr. Vincent had thought that the fire would be the reason, because in the UPS Flight 6 situation, the fire burnt through the hold in the cargo bay, and it starts to damage the electronics. And then in that situation, this can explain why the plane's going dark. There was even a Wired article that was written saying like,
Oh, fascinating. So you're saying
yeah,
that explains the transponder situation.
exactly. So this is why the plane really went dark. A Wired article says, you know, a startling simple explanation for what happened to MH370 was to be an electrical fire, that somehow the wires got burnt, and then the first thing the pilot would do would pull the main bus, plane would go dark, right? And so you look at that scenario and you go, oh, well, if I just add this little shift to it and say it wasn't just spontaneous fire, it was the lithium-ion batteries ignited. And then maybe they had already kind of started and very quickly caused the plane to go dark within like a minute. And they might not have gotten like a sensor saying beep, 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 warning, fire in the cargo bay, et cetera. And once that thing is started, now it's just a race against the clock.
Yeah,
Like
especially if you've got 500 pounds,
Exactly.
which is what they had. That's like a confirmed fact. That's not a conspiracy.
487 pounds to be
487
exact. Yep.
of lithium ion. So, okay, you said that they had not logged that, though, that they were putting it onto the plane. So my instant rational brain is, why not log that? And also, why not just instantly tell the public, it looks like there was a fire? That actually puts people at calm. It was a fire event. We're still looking for the plane, but it looks like the plane was on fire.
And so that's the big question, right? Like if this was a fire event, and I'll tell more evidence related because there's a lot, why cover it up? Why not mention it right away? The answer to me is pretty straightforward. If you mention there was this batteries on board the plane on March 9th, 2014, the day after the plane disappeared, everyone's going to immediately hone in on the fire scenario because it's the most logical explanation. Your plane is turning back and going to Penang, the closest airport to land a Boeing 777. It's obviously an emergency scenario, right? Why doesn't the plane land there? Well, probably because the smoke was covering the windshield of the cockpit just the same way it did with UPS Flight 6. That was the reason why that plane crashed. Because you would say, why couldn't it get back on the ground? They couldn't see anything. It's the middle of the night. It's pitch black as well. They have no power. It's not safe for them to land either. They have no light either. In fact, there are 20 witnesses, maybe even more, but 20 that we found just from looking through news articles, all corroborate a fire event. They've all been discredited. There's no witnesses that corroborate a suicide or anything like that. When the plane goes dark and turns back, some of these other experts that have investigated the plane have determined based on the radar that the plane actually did an emergency descent maneuver. That's the opposite of what you would do in a suicidal scenario. If you're trying to make everybody pass out, you want to increase your altitude and depressurize the plane. If you're flying low, you're potentially doing that because you need to get the smoke out of the plane and have people have enough oxygen to be able to breathe, which means you have to fly under 10,000 feet. So we've got that. We've got Mike McKay on an oil rig, who, if you look back at his reported sighting, he says he saw the plane on fire. And if he saw the plane on fire for he says 5 seconds, he has a smoke break on his oil rig and he sees it far off in the distance. Turns out it had just rained, so it was perfect visual conditions to see. And he sees it low on the horizon, which is why the media distorts his report and says he saw the plane crash. He says, no, I didn't see the plane crash. I just saw it looked like a plane on fire for a few seconds. There was 9 witnesses along the coast that all hear loud noises at the exact same moment, which would indicate, this plane, the battery is exploding, something like that. Sound carries on water. Plane turns back around. There's 8 fishermen on a boat 10 miles off the coast of Malaysia and Thailand in between there. And they see the plane flying unusually low. Again, consistent with that turn back analysis that was done. So right away, we can tell, you might say, oh, this was the perfect location for them to turn off the plane. That's what I think the people who think this pilot did it say. But you could also just say it's also the perfect location in general for an operation, or it's a perfect location to, have your plane go dark if you want to have people be very confused. The other thing too is that the last witness, so after the plane gets to Penang, doesn't land, and starts flying to the Nicobar Islands, we have Catherine T. She's the star witness. Her sighting is well reported. She had a blog back then, so she blogged all about it. She reported it when she got to Thailand. She was on a boat with her husband and one other person. Middle of the night, she was on, on deck for, duty to make sure they don't crash into anything or what have you. And she sees this plane flying unusually low, no navigation lights, glowing orange with dark smoke coming out of the back of it. And she sees it flying low and descending over the course of her sighting. This is consistent with a China Times only report. U.S. government, no Western media ever picked it up, that China had intercepted a Navy communication from MH370 from the Taipei embassy, I believe, in Thailand, that the plane was attempting an emergency landing and disintegrating. And this is consistent with the fire event and what Catherine T saw and what we see in those videos where we're looking at these two smoke trails coming out of the back of the plane. Those videos that we just watched as well, we can tell the plane's very low because those clouds we see, cumulus clouds, they only form at very low altitudes. And it looks like this plane's doing a turn as well. If you're trying to land in the ocean, you don't need to land straight. You can spin your way down to get down to the water as well. Even the direction of travel is consistent with Catherine T's sighting and even consistent with the videos as well. So we've got this whole scenario that now looks like, well, this is a fire event. But if it's a fire, like I talked to Billy Vincent and a couple other experts that have testified on the Hill related to fire events on planes, and they said that the plane could last for an hour. Billy Vincent thought the plane could last for several hours because the fire suppression devices, I looked them up as well, they have about 3 hours of fuel. They have these automatic ones that deploy to immediately put the fire out, and they have the slow rate bottles. There's like 5 bottles of these, looks like a little like kind of bomb from the old Acme cartoons, you know? And so they could keep this thing at bay, but it's never going to make it 8 hours into the South Indian Ocean to where it goes down there.
So just a question, what would be happening on board? Let's map out this fire event, because what would happen if lithium ion is now in the air? Because I think you mentioned before that the pilot had passed out very quickly in UPS 6.
Yeah, so a lot of it, of course, is going to be somewhat speculative because we don't have videos or anything going on. But one thing that's another very, very strong piece of evidence is the Malaysian Minister of Defense. If people haven't watched the video, and I'll make sure I send it to you to add in here a couple of the clips, he did an interview with the Australian broadcaster about 7 weeks after this plane disappeared. Plenty of time to have all the facts available. And he won't say anything verifiable about this plane at that point.
An aircraft unidentified was detected that morning.
That came out. I've said that at the beginning, and I think that's confirmed by the Prime Minister too.
What did the military do when it was detected?
Well, I mean, it is an airline that came from our airspace. It's a commercial airline, and the military has actually said that they didn't consider it as a hostile aircraft.
Why? What were they relying on to come to the conclusion that it wasn't hostile?
Well, and that's a call by the officer that was in charge of it. And like I said earlier, there was an inquiry under the Royal Military Air Force. That will come out too.
Well, one thing he does is he slips up. He says they knew it was a commercial plane and they knew it wasn't hostile. That's why they didn't send up jets to track the plane.
That's the first thing. Like if there's a plane going off course, you're thinking, okay, terrorist attack, and why aren't you sending the jets?
And his answers are so crazy. He's like, he asked the interviewer, well, why would we send up jets? Would you shoot down the plane? And she's going, what do you mean shoot down the plane? Like, just track the plane, right? You've got a rogue plane. He said, well, why would we do that? We knew it's not hostile.
So he messed up.
And he messed up because how could you know it's not hostile?
Unless you know it's not
Unless
hostile.
you have communication with the plane, right? That's the only way. Because otherwise it could be a hijacking. Could be a suicidal
First thing,
pilot.
must be, suicidal.
So now we're starting to see what really happened is that they had communication with the plane. They just didn't, they classified those communications. They never released them. Selective release of information, right? Lies by omission. One of the other things he says too is, she asks him, why would you shoot down the plane? And he goes, well, the Americans would. And you're like, wait, what? It looks like he's looking at his handler. He gets these weird facial expressions. The Malaysian people were so upset about this guy in this interview. If you read the YouTube comments, they're like, why is he smiling? Like, who's he looking at? They keep wondering. Like, it's pretty clear in my mind that this guy got the call. Like you've got to toe the line. And he was not prepared for this interview at all.
Why would he say, so he says, say it again, the American people would? So
yeah,
the
it was actually
asked,
offensive to me. It was like he was evoking 9/11, right? Because he's like, she asked him, why shoot down the plane? You know, because she's trying to say like, you would just track the plane. Why are you kind of being evasive about this? And he's like, well, the Americans would. And you're like, it's just out of nowhere too. And it's almost like when people have all these lies in their head and they've just got to, they're trying not to get it out, but it just subconsciously gets out there. It's almost like he's saying the Americans talk to him. And he, you know, he's got to be careful not to say it, but somehow it just kind of blurted out.
Yeah, let's actually check out that moment right now because that sounds crazy.
But why not send the jets up if you have conceded earlier that you knew very early in the morning the plane was missing? There was 4.5 hours time in which to respond.
It was
and
not
find out.
hostile, it was commercial, it was from our airspace, we're not at war with anybody.
If they did go up, in hindsight, would you agree that we wouldn't be in the situation we are now, which is
I don't think
7 weeks of
so. I don't
searching,
think that's
billions of
speculative.
dollars?
Even if we send it back, are you going to say that we're going to shoot it down?
Well, you said that, not me.
No, I'm asking you.
I could not possibly
So what's
answer
the,
that.
if
I'm
we're not going to,
Minister
if
of
not going to
Defence.
shoot it down, what's the point of sending it up?
To see where it's going.
Well, to see it going, you need a fighter for that. If we're talking about military procedures, and if I did shoot it down, you'll be the first to say, how can you shoot down a commercial airline with 14 nationals, half of them Chinese? I'll be in a worse position probably.
Why shoot it down, though, if it's not hostile?
Well, the Americans would.
So that is remarkably strange. He does this press conference. It kind of yields more questions than answers.
So
Why even mention the Americans? This is an incident that happened in Malaysia, kind of a random country to pick to say something
Yeah.
about. And you think he got the call?
Oh, absolutely. And then, going back to the fire, the overall question of like, what was actually happening here? This is the part where the reason why I give that disclaimer in the beginning for condolences for the families is I personally don't believe many, if anybody, was even alive when we get to that point in the videos, because the oxygen masks on airplanes only last like 15 or 20 minutes, little known fact. So you better not be holding out for those as your hope if something were to happen on your airplane. And the lithium-ion toxic smoke is extremely dangerous. There was an incident just a couple months ago in South Korea where like 23 people died from a fire in a factory. And you ask, like, how could all these people die inside of a building where you could just run out? There's even videos of them battling the blaze. And that's when you realize, like, 1 to 2 inhalations and you pass out. And then you just become overwhelmed out there. So the pilots were in a better situation. They have their own oxygen and they have full breather headset that they can put on them. So if I had to speculate, I would say that at least one, if not both of the pilots were okay, probably even at the point where these videos happened. But the passengers, as that smoke is starting to build up in the cabin, they might not even notice it and you just fall asleep and then you never wake up ever again. So that's the thing that I think is really scary. The co-pilot's cell phone pings a cell tower when they fly over Penang as well, which indicates that they were flying very low. In fact, probably under 7,000 feet. Because like, if you try to put your phone on when you're in an airplane, once you get up a certain height and certain altitude, you don't have any service anymore.
Unless it's 9/11 and it's 2001, but we'll save that for another day.
That's a whole nother fiasco
We'll save
to
that
deal with
for
in
another
general.
day.
But yeah, but the 9/11, that thought was always in the back of everyone's mind 10 years ago when we were thinking about this as well, which makes it even more ridiculous. Like they didn't send up jets to track the plane, because some people actually speculate that that hijackers took the plane and they were going to crash it into the Petronas Towers, which are 2 of the tallest buildings on the face of the earth. I've actually been in the buildings, really nice buildings, by the way. So you would think it's crazy to think that they would not be afraid of a Boeing 777 flying rogue through their airspace.
And yet they knew it was not hostile. So
Yep.
yeah, there was a communication there. And by the way, how did they wind up discrediting Catherine T?
Yeah. So
By the way, what country is she from?
she's from the UK, but she's, an expatriate, so she's all over the country, all over the world, et cetera, which, I have an affinity for because I lived in Singapore for several years, right next to Malaysia, actually. A lot of my friends are from all over the world as well. I spoke to Catherine T personally because I wanted to hear her story, see if it changed at all. I noticed her last Twitter post before I spoke to her in like 2022 was, why have the families gone silent? The silence is sinister. That was like her last post. And you realize like, she's not lying. Like unless she's in this con for the long game, like lying 8 years later.
To what end?
Didn't make any sense. And so when I spoke to her, like everything, she basically reiterated everything that she said in her blogs. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was I asked her, what time do you think you saw the plane? Because I wanted to get a good time tag, because all these experts have tried to massage the time. She says 1840 UTC. And I go, whoa, that's the time when the Subang air traffic control said they lost contact with the plane. That's the time the plane's in the location where our coordinates are at. That China Times reported Mayday call, that was the plane disintegrating. They said that that was at 2:43 a.m., which if that's Malaysian time, that's 18:43 UTC. That's within 5 minutes of Catherine T saying it. Then she says, I felt pressured by the other experts to change my time. They were all trying to get me to change the time to fit with their narratives. And I asked these other independent group experts, none of them could give me any reason why they would be dismissing her. It can't be possible because, the plane couldn't possibly be on fire and last as long, because they all just blindly believed the Inmarsat pings are a source of truth, unfalsifiable. They just thought that must be what happened in this situation. Catherine T as well, the glowing orange plane. I always wondered, and this was actually one of my favorite pieces I wrote when I was writing on Twitter, like kind of logging everything that I was discovering, because everybody was trying to shoot me down for this. You believe aliens zapped the plane or whatever. And then I find the fire event in Catherine T and I go, there's a real world scenario that makes a lot of sense. It doesn't include aliens or anything else like this. That's really undeniable. And the reason why the plane was glowing orange is because halon 1301, the fire extinguishing gas, has bromine in it. And bromine is a halogen gas. So if you've got this gas and it's pumping onto these batteries, and maybe some of the crew are trying to pour water on it, you could have this chemical reaction that's releasing bromine. Halogen gas glows orange. So you can imagine, why has this plane got this orange mist around it? Because you've got bromine being leaked out there. And once I piece this stuff together with all these witnesses, I'm like, here you go, experts, like, do your worst. Try to explain how this is not possible, And then back to the original point, it's like, okay, well, but how does the fire event fit in with these videos now? Like, they corroborate it because we see the smoke coming out of the back of it. But then when you look at the videos again, you go, oh, this is why we made up this fake story about the South Indian Ocean. We can't explain these videos to the public, especially not in 2014, probably not even in 2024, to be honest, because this is some technology that people are not ready on this world to accept. And I don't believe that those orbs are aliens. I don't even believe there's anything inside those orbs. I think they're autonomous balls of plasma. And if we have that technology, there's a lot of tough questions that are going to be asked, like, where did we get this technology? How long have we been hiding this technology? What does this mean about our reality if we can just have 3 orbs spin around a plane and then poof, it shoots through, let's say, a wormhole, because that's what I think we're looking at, and goes to a different location on Earth instantaneously? Like, this brings up a lot of Star Trek level technology. And who has this, And I think the biggest thing would be, if we have this technology, how can you justify keeping this hidden from the public? Like, it would change everything about our entire planet.